Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm one of your hosts, Katie Halper.
I'm the other host, Aaron Mate. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Our website is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. This week, we are joined by a wonderful guest, Scott Horton, who has a brand new book. It's called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. And we'll be speaking to Scott about that whole catastrophe in Ukraine and a whole lot more, because luckily for us, we're involved in so many catastrophes around the world, from Ukraine to the Middle East. And Scott has a lot to say on these topics.
And make sure, if you don't already, support us. If you're not already members at usefulidiotspodcast.com, make sure you do become members, because Scott has some really interesting things to say about Israel in the bonus portion of the interview. And of course, as always, you get the Thursday Throwdown, your midweek dose of media madness. So many reasons to give yourself the gift of our podcast extended membership.
All right, let's get to our four basic food groups, starting with Democrats suck. Antony Blinken, our outgoing Secretary of State, is making the rounds. And with just 1 month left of the Biden presidency, it's time to reflect. It's time to reflect on a job well done for a guy whose job is supposed to be a diplomat, but has spent his time promoting war, whether it's in Ukraine or when it comes to Gaza, facilitating an outright genocide. So Antony Blinken recently did an event at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. And he was asked to reflect on how historians will look back on the Biden administration's foreign policy. And this is some of what Antony Blinken had to say.
The other side of the coin, the part that we've been responsible for, has been to really re-engage, re-energize, rejuvenate, and in many ways reimagine our alliances and partnerships. And as I sit here today, I feel confident that even with all of the problems you listed, it makes you wonder why anyone would want this job, we're actually in a much stronger position than we were to contend with them. Because we're stronger at home, because we've restored and in many ways rethought our partnerships around the world.
We've re-engaged, re-energized, rejuvenated, restored, and rethought. That's a lot of
verbs.
A lot of verbs. And I didn't hear anything concrete in terms of what we actually did. It's right. A lot of like, he sounds like a self-help leader about rejuvenating and re-energizing your life, not being a diplomat whose job is to avoid conflict, not fuel it. And how he can sit there and claim that we're in a stronger position when you have the world on fire, I think in large part due to the job he's done, which is to promote war rather than end it. That's beyond me.
Yeah, well, I like the way, in certain ways, Aaron, I'm going to give him credit for thinking outside the box, right? Like, he is a diplomat, but he does more kind of warmongering. He is a diplomat, but he does more kind of self-help guidance. Yeah. So maybe that's how he'll be remembered, as a visionary, as a trailblazer.
Like, is anybody feeling rejuvenated and re-energized at the sight of Gaza being destroyed? I mean, if you're like a sadist? If you're a sadist, yes, I guess you're rejuvenated at the sight of Gaza destroyed, children starving, people, tens of thousands of people murdered. But aside from sadists, I don't see how you can feel as if the world's come out stronger and rejuvenated because of the job he's done.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been getting such R&R, such good R&R with this genocide. Feel really refreshed. It's disgusting. Well, we also have warmongers, obviously, on the other side of the aisle. And, Trump does like to run as an anti-war kind of iconoclast, but he's not one of those. And he makes his support of Israel very, very clear, and also warmongering in Syria. So here he is speaking at Mar-a-Lago on Fox News, and he remembers the days that he bombed Syria. And claims, in contrast to previous comments, that he doesn't understand why Russia is involved. Let's take a look.
I can say that Assad was a butcher. What he did to children. You remember I attacked him with the 58 missiles, unbelievable missiles coming from ships 700 miles away, and every one of them hit their target. But I did that. That was the red line in the sand. Obama drew it, and then he refused to honor what he did. He said, if anybody goes across the red line, and Assad killed many more children after that, and Obama did nothing, but I did. I hit him with a lot of missiles. In fact, President Xi was sitting here the night he was in that dining room having chocolate cake. Remember the famous chocolate cake? But and that's when I explained what we were doing as the missiles were shot. And it was amazing as to precision, because every one of those missiles hit its target from a long distance away. Had President Obama drawn the line and where it meant something, you wouldn't have even had Russia there. But in the end, I never understood why Russia went there. They were not getting very much out of it.
So that is an interesting shift, as Michael Tracy points out, from Trump in 2015 when he said about Russia, they're going to do some bombing of ISIS, which frankly I think is a great thing. Let Russia bomb ISIS.
You know, Trump, who's not known for being so attentive to details, knew a lot of details there in his fond memory of the president of China eating chocolate cake while Trump bombed Syria. It's interesting what memory he can hang on to. And he certainly is obviously very proud of the fact that he bombed Syria. And nice to see him reminiscing over a great time in his presidency. And I'm sure he's looking forward to many more bombing opportunities now that he's coming back into office.
It kind of reminds me of, remember when Nancy Pelosi was speaking to Hillary Clinton and they were talking about how all roads lead to Putin. And Nancy was like, you remember that blue dress I was wearing, right? We all remember that blue dress.
That's when she stood up to Donald Trump at a meeting and pointed her finger at him and said, with you, all roads lead to Putin. And then we're all supposed to cheer. That is some brave moment where Trump is finally being, called out for his secret conspiracy with Putin. And that's like how we're supposed to resist him, is embodied by Nancy Pelosi.
In her blue dress, which we're all supposed to remember.
Yes.
Much like the chocolate cake.
The chocolate cake. Yes.
Yeah. And at that same press event, Trump had some interesting things to say about his discussions with Netanyahu.
We had a very good talk. We discussed what is going to happen. And I'll be very available on January 20th, and we'll see. As you know, I gave warning that if these hostages aren't back home by that date, all hell's going to break out, and very strong. But we generally just discussed. I asked him, where are things? Mike Waltz they're doing a great job, by the way. Everybody is very happy. I think he's doing a fantastic job. But he was very much involved in the call. But it was a recap call more than anything else. So
much for Trump forcing Israel to end the war, as many people were predicting he would do.
Yeah, I mean, if Trump really is serious about that warning about how the hostages have to be returned, he should be pressuring Netanyahu to finally make the deal he's been avoiding. But of course, he's not. It's not what he's referring to. He's saying it's all on Hamas. And again, we don't know how many captives have been killed by Israeli strikes at this point. There's constantly speculation that more are dying in these unending Israeli bombings, which of course continue to massacre Palestinian civilians. It's become so normalized now to see just dozens of dead Palestinian civilians. And we're all supposed to just accept that as normal. Trump certainly has, because he never criticizes it.
Right. All right. What do we got for Isn't That Weird?
Isn't That Weird? Let's turn to arguably the weirdest story in U.S. politics today. And that is the mysterious drones over New Jersey, which, after a long time now, no one can give an answer for as to what these drones are. Well, one lawmaker does have an answer. And his name is Doug Mastriano. He is a state senator from Pennsylvania, a Republican. And he recently came out with this. He says, it is inconceivable that the federal government has no answers nor has taken any action to get to the bottom of the unidentified drones. And just to underscore how serious this is, he posted a picture alongside his complaint. It's a very serious aircraft that has been apparently found and hoisted on a truck. The one problem, though, is that the picture is that not of a drone that was over New Jersey, but of an aircraft that is used in the movie Star Wars. It's a spaceship, either a prop from the film or a replica of a spaceship used in Star Wars, as people on Twitter pointed out. So,
well, I mean, that's one theory, but maybe it actually is not a mistake, but that it's actually what's happening. I mean, it could be an actual Star Wars invasion.
So whoever these Martians are, rather than fly their own aircraft, they've either built a replica of the Star Wars aircraft or they've stolen the aircraft used in the Star Wars movie franchise, repurposed them to actually fly in space, and now they're flying over New Jersey. Well,
Or Star Wars is a documentary, and this is actually like Darth Vader people.
Well, who knows at this point? Who knows in this crazy world what is real and fictional anymore? But the senator from Pennsylvania, that's his contribution. And of course, there are other Republicans who have said things like this came from an Iranian mothership. So people are going to all kinds of leaps from Star Wars to Iran. And still, though, we don't have a concrete answer as to what's going on. But I'm sure if we keep coming up with theories like this, we'll get closer.
Well, speaking of fact and fiction, people probably remember that we showed you a video of Clarissa Ward of CNN, quote unquote, discovering the last prisoner at one of Assad's prisons. And we thought and we, along with many other people on the internet, thought that it looked a little suspicious, didn't really look authentic, didn't look like an actual prisoner, someone who had been locked up for years and was the last person to be released for various reasons. Well, we have an update on that story. Let's take a listen to Sky News.
Now, the broadcast crew were filming in an empty prison when they stumbled upon what appeared to be the only locked cell in the secret facility. Rescued a victim of Assad's brutal regime, except he wasn't a victim at all. The man they set free was later identified as Salama Mohammed Salama, one of Assad's most brutal lieutenants, responsible for the savage torture of civilians.
He clutches my arm tightly with both hands.
So I guess that's an example of some terrible reporting from CNN, and it is pretty terrible. It was terrible enough acting, or terrible enough props and costume design and hair and makeup, I would say, that most people saw through it. And here's Clarissa Ward in her own words explaining what happened.
So what do we know about this man now?
Well, Jake, obviously from the minute we witnessed this astonishing moment, we were trying to dig up more information on this prisoner. We weren't able to find anything with the name he gave us, Adel Khurbal. But in the days after our report aired, CNN started talking to people in the city of Homs who told us that his real name is, in fact, Salama Mohammed Salama. He is reportedly a lieutenant in the Air Force Intelligence Directorate. He is also known as Abu Hamza. He was known to run.
So look, she's admitting right here that they aired this segment of the supposedly, freed political prisoner without checking who he was.
Right.
So she's acknowledging,
fact-checking it.
yeah, she's acknowledging that she didn't do journalism, which of course she's not going to articulate, but that's what the admission is. They aired this segment. They saw it as some great, huge moment that they had uncovered, and she was thinking, probably I'm going to win some big award for this. So let's just rush it out there without fact checking it. And then days later, finally, after everybody mocked her for it, that's when they started fact checking.
Right, and it's interesting because she presents it like this is due diligence to check after you stream. Of course, it's the opposite. Yeah.
Yes, we all know in journalism, you put out a story and then you fact check it afterward.
Yeah.
Yes.
Run Air Force intelligence checkpoints in the city of Homs. He's accused of extorting and harassing people. And we have now been able to corroborate the information those residents gave us with a photograph of Salama. And it's clear that far from being an ordinary guy, as he presented himself to be, he was a part of Bashar.
I love the chyron. CNN follows up on prisoner relief.
Right.
No, CNN gets caught putting out a fake story. And now is trying to backtrack in the most cowardly way because they're not taking ownership of the fact that they did not do their due diligence.
Do you think there's any way they thought this was real?
I don't know what goes on the minds of these people. I mean, Clarissa Ward is notorious for putting out stunts, for putting out regime change propaganda. So I don't think thoughts like this cross her mind. She's just doing her job, which is to be a propagandist.
Right. Well, I do want to give her I do want to congratulate her because she managed to actually unite both sides of the Syrian conflict, because you had people who were both Assad supporters and Assad haters who were outraged by this. So maybe that's what's needed to bring the country back together. She's actually
Clarissa
doing
Ward doing
peace
bad
and
journalism.
reconciliation
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there we
Yeah.
go. Yeah. Clarissa Ward's rare contribution to humanity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And those have been your 4 basic food groups. For this week's interview, we are joined by Scott Horton. He is host of The Scott Horton Show and author of the brand new book, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. And just to set the scene, a theme of this interview is that so much of what was previously dismissed as Russian propaganda is now admitted out in the open, such as the fact that there was a peace deal negotiated between Ukraine and Russia right after Russia invaded in February 2022, but that the US and UK stood in the way and prevented this deal from going through. When people like us pointed that out when it was happening, that was called Russian propaganda. Now there's so much evidence that it's hard to dismiss that as Russian propaganda anymore. And another example of this is the fact that this is called the proxy war.
Right.
When critics of the Ukraine proxy war would call it a proxy war, that was also dismissed as Russian propaganda. But let's hear from one of the chief proxy warriors himself, Boris Johnson, who was the British prime minister when Russia invaded. And he's the one who famously went over to Zelensky and told him not to finalize that peace deal that Ukraine had negotiated with Russia in the early months of the war. Listen to how Boris Johnson recently described the war in Ukraine.
We are, let's face it, we're waging a proxy war. We're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the ability to do the job. And for years and years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and it has been cruel. It has been cruel, and we need now to give them what they need.
So according to Boris Johnson, we're waging a proxy war using Ukraine, but that part it's not cruel to use Ukraine to fight a proxy war. It's cruel that we're not giving all the weapons possible to fight that proxy war. That's the Boris Johnson perspective. And that is the perspective that Scott Horton takes apart in his new book, Provoked, a very detailed account of the U.S. role in provoking the proxy war in Ukraine and prolonging it ever since. So we're going to hear now from Scott Horton talking about the war in Ukraine and also the crisis in the Middle East, which he also has a lot of thoughts about. This is our interview with Scott Horton. Scott Horton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you.
The book is called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. This book is a huge achievement. First of all, you are just so comprehensive in your history of the war in Ukraine, going far beyond, Ukraine itself to all the other areas in which, in your telling, the U.S. has basically provoked Russia and caused this new Cold War that we're in. So just starting with a very broad question, just talk to us about your aim with this book and what you think is most important for people to understand about the background to the proxy war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you again, both of you, so much for having me. And I have to say, Aaron, this is no fault of your own, but the whole time I was writing this book, you are like a ghost, because I know you're like hovering over me, haunting me, because I know that you're writing a book about this too. And I know that you are such a great journalist. I, of course, cite you in my book over and over again on so many different issues from, well, obviously, especially on Russiagate, but on all different stuff. And you're just so good on things that I literally had to stop reading your Substack, because every time I do, I think, oh my God, this guy's going to think I'm ripping him off when my book comes out and he reads it, because what I have to say is so close to what you have to say all the time. And I've just been terrified that your book was going to come out before mine, and that then I even had a plan. I know I'm crazy, but I had a plan. As soon as your book comes out, I'm going to send you a copy of my document. I'm going to say, look, dude, this is what I have so far. I swear to God, I'm not plagiarizing your book when I have all the same stuff as you. And because I just have been terrified, and only as like friendly competition, right? Like, I'm the second best skater at the ramp, dude, and I'm just trying to measure up to you is all, really. But you're just a huge inspiration to me. You're great journalism and all that. So, I mean, my fear I describe is in the highest and best of spirit of admiration for what you do. And
that's very kind.
Trying to
There's
measure
the problem. There's the problem when you can count on like two hands the amount of people who tell the truth about these major conflicts.
Yeah.
Is that it seems to be like it's like a commodity. Who can actually get out the facts. And so therefore the few people who do, like you think, that they're all sort of like in concert, but really it's just such a small, if like we had a media that did its job, it wouldn't be a competition to see who can get out the truth first, because everybody would do it.
Yeah, seriously. And of course, this whole time, as everyone has been doing such a great job opposing the war, I've been saving up all of my great work in one big Word document and not showing it to anyone until now, right? So it's all in there, but you had to wait until now to get it. So there you go. And I should talk about this too, because I think this is so cool. I didn't know about this. This guy, Jonathan Haslam, is a professor at Harvard. And he's written this book called Hubris. Now, this is the English version, which doesn't have America in the subtitle because it's the English version. The American version doesn't come out until January, so I beat him too. But the book is called Hubris, The American Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. And it's the same book, only shorter and sweeter and better written because it's by a real historian and a real writer who's done such a great job on it. But I'm reading it now, and it's also, really great, but it has all kinds of stuff I didn't know. Quotes and facts and things that, would tend to bolster my case, but that I was unaware of. So I'm having a great time reading that too. My last book on the terror war came out about 2 months or something after Max Blumenthal's book, The Management of Savagery, which is just the same book as my book, only told from his point of view instead of mine.
You're like on a gray zone track.
Yeah, seriously. Like we're just great minds think alike kind of thing. Or
ours evil ones, as my father always says, but that doesn't apply to you.
That's right. No, certainly not.
Yeah, not at all.
But no, I'm thrilled to just be in such great company. That's all I'm really trying to say here. So thank you. And I can't wait to read your book. I know it's going to absolutely kill on Russiagate and the war and everything. Can't wait for it. And now I can start reading your Substack again. I already have. I was reading your Israel-Palestine stuff, but I wasn't reading any of your Ukraine stuff. That's true story. I was like, man, I can't read this guy's stuff anymore. He's going to think that I'm just ripping him up. Anyway, sorry.
Well, let's get to your book. So you go through a very long history here, and it will be impossible for us to cover it all in this interview. Yeah. But I guess, for people who still, this war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion phase of this war in Ukraine, because of course the actual war began, arguably 10 years ago with the Maidan coup. But people who are still just not familiar with the basics, what do you think is most important to understand from a book like yours about this war?
Well, so I've been practicing, Aaron. I'm going to do the bullet pointiest version of this all the way through.
How many pages is your book? 7?
It's 7 by 10. So it's only 690 pages.
Right. Just under 700, yeah.
When it's 6 by 9, which the next edition's I got a different printer. It's going to be 6 by 9. The hardback's going to be 6 by 9. So that'll come in at 938. However, about a third of that is citations. When we took the URLs out of the citations, that saved 77 pages of just web addresses. So that's how thoroughly cited every claim is in there in the antiwar.com style for you. But so the super bullet points are, yes, they promised not to expand NATO, then they did it anyway. They did the shock therapy, economic policy. They did the Balkan Wars, and they did missile defense, color-coded revolutions, and especially the promises to expand NATO all the way into Ukraine and Georgia. And then, of course, with the color-coded revolutions, the biggest and most important of those is the one you already mentioned, was the overthrow of the government in 2014, which led to the loss of Crimea and the outbreak of war in the East. And the unresolved nature of that conflict is probably the single most important factor in causing the current war. But I think importantly for people's recent memory here, in Joe Biden's first year, it was decided, I think, by spring by the Russians that they were coming. And I think the Americans started to get that idea. And they decided that what they would do is that they would tell the Russians, you better not, but that they would not really engage in any negotiation in good faith, because that would be appeasement, like when Neville Chamberlain gave in to Hitler. And honestly, I hate to say this, guys, because it sounds like I'm giving him an out. Like when I used to talk about George Bush being stupid and people say, I'm making excuses for him as though now he's not as responsible for his choices or something like that. But the thing is, Joe Biden is stupid. He's always been stupid. And the people around him also all are stupid. And if you listen to them talk, the reason that they reach for these cheap historical analogies is because they actually don't know anything about it. So instead they go, well, this is just like Neville Chamberlain and Hitler, which they don't actually know anything about that either. But they know that you're supposed to be Churchill and not Chamberlain. And so that's basically the deal. The other metaphor they all reach for, these dorks, they're always pretend in the analogy like they are the all-star on the baseball team, hero here, but they're the dork in the analogy. And what they always say is, it's just like in the schoolyard. You have to punch the bully in the nose to make him stop. And the thing is, they were never the tough guy, but good guy in the neighborhood who punched the bully in the nose. They were always the cowering dork who needed the good guy to save them. So that's their outlook on life. You listen to these people. That's how they all talk about these issues. And so for Joe Biden, his position in 21 was to threaten Putin, but never to negotiate with him in any good faith. And the most frustrating part of this truly is that Biden himself, and he is the president for as demented as he is, he never meant to bring Ukraine into NATO. And he said so repeatedly.
That's right.
He also never meant to install missile defense systems in Ukraine, which can be, they're dual use launchers that can host Tomahawk cruise missiles. He never intended to do that either. And he said both of those things in his December 30th phone call with Putin, but he refused to put it in writing. He refused to sit down and send, high-level diplomats, Tony Blinken, go over there and hash this thing out with Lavrov, and let's just do it. And, there were quotes, I guess anonymous quotes, but still from administration officials to the Post and the Times saying that Putin's proposed treaty is not that unreasonable. Of course, they're not just going to sign on the bottom line, but it was not a deal that was made to be rejected, like Madeleine Albright's Rambouillet Accord, right? Where it's this, a deal you must refuse. It was not that. It was potentially the basis for real negotiations. But what happened? They had this stupid open door policy, which said, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO, but you can't tell us that we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. So if we were going to put that in writing now, then that would be because you're holding a gun to our head, and we'll never let that happen. We'd rather see a few 100,000 Ukrainians die and extend a war for a few years than to give in to extortion on this Hitlerian level, was how they portrayed it. And I think how they understood it themselves. And so, and then as you guys I know are well familiar, they announced from the very beginning, they told David Sanger of the New York Times, who's probably the most important guy on this type of a beat, highest ranking guy at the Times. And he said the goal is to lock Russia into a long-term battle. That was the phrase, lock them in to a long-term struggle in Ukraine.
Which is a quagmire.
That's right. So you would think all other 8 billion of us would think, no, stop, cease fire, negotiate, figure it out, end the war. Whatever it is, we can't have a hot war on Russia's border when they're holding on to thousands of nukes, and you have Western powers, the superpower, world empire instigating it and all this stuff. We have to negotiate. And then, no, here we are. We're having this conversation almost 3 years later, and Blinken hasn't talked to Lavrov virtually at all since then, other than short conversations over the release of the basketball player lady. And that's it. And I'm not saying that we're in danger of nuclear war, but I am saying that they have raised the risk of nuclear war by a significant degree, and that they have absolutely no right to do so, especially not for such essentially diplomatic games that they're playing here with the Russians that is totally unnecessary to do.
You raised a few points there that I want to just clarify for people who are not familiar with the details. So at the end of 2021, Putin and Biden had this phone call where, according to the Kremlin, Biden does say, we have no intention of putting offensive weaponry into Ukraine. And Russia says, great, this is good. This is the basis for more talks. And then so the following month, January 2022, there are more talks. But all of a sudden, the U.S. refuses to put that into writing, as Scott was just saying. And on the point about Ukraine, people might be confused because people think that the whole point of this war, from Russia's perspective, was to prevent Ukraine from getting into NATO. So that how is it that then you're saying that Biden had no intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And my point there was that this open door to Ukraine was always a backdoor through which NATO could fight Russia. So you promise Ukraine this future membership, and under that pretense, you integrate Ukraine militarily into NATO without ever actually giving it the security guarantees of membership. And that's been the game that's been played from the start, that like they've always been dangling this future membership for Ukraine. But whenever Ukraine says, hey, can we come in now? The U.S. says no. And Joe Biden has said Ukraine's not ready. And it's like this combination of arrogance that the Russians aren't going to tell us what to do, but also cynicism is we're going to use this promise of future membership to keep integrating Ukraine into NATO's military infrastructure without actually giving Ukraine the security guarantees that will defend it when it gets attacked.
Right. So in other words, if it was deliberate, that would be a great way to bait Russia into a war.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying that it's deliberate. I'm saying it's Democrats doing their best, but this is their best is in effect. They were causing it. And you're absolutely right. They call it interoperability, where they're standardizing Ukraine's military. And they had just announced in September and again in November, the State Department and the Defense Department in 21 announced that, we're moving forward even further with that. So in other words, if NATO and Russia went to war, Ukraine's military would be just another auxiliary along with the rest of them. Hungary and Poland and Lithuania and whoever's militaries are in NATO, they would all be fighting under the NATO banner. Ukraine would be too. But then as you're saying, and I quote, numerous, think tankers and university experts and whatever in the book, calling this the worst of both worlds for Ukraine, where it really is, let's you and him fight. But no, I'm not promising to jump in. I'm promising that one day I'll promise to jump in. But right now, I'm not promising that, but still you and him fight. And which is really unfair to do.
The verbiage that Blinken and others in the Biden administration came up to justify this, they talked about how we've given Ukraine an irreversible invitation, and we've given Ukraine a well-lit bridge toward NATO, but we're never actually giving Ukraine the information it needs on what it can do to actually join NATO. So just because you invite someone to something, like even if the invitation is irreversible, it doesn't matter if you're not actually going to let them in. So like just the language they use to like avoid giving Ukraine actual membership is just it speaks to just the cynicism involved here.
I'm curious. Let's say that Biden actually did care about Ukrainians. Let's say the Biden administration did care about Ukrainians. What would they have done differently?
Okay, well, so first of all, in a way, they were trying to deter Russia, right? They were serious when they were saying, you better not. We're going to wage an economic war against you. We're going to pour weapons in. I think everyone assumed that the government would fall and that Russia would have the run of the place. But it's a big country. It's about the size of Texas. And we could arm up an insurgency from neighboring states and replicate the Afghan model and the Syria model. It was unbelievable. They're invoking Afghanistan 3 months after America's humiliating defeat and withdrawal from the consequences of that one. And after, just a couple of years after they built a caliphate and had to destroy it again. And they're invoking these two wars as the model. So I think they were trying to make him think twice about it. In that sense, they were trying to deter it. And, I quote, and I'm sorry, I got a better, more specific answer to that, but I wanted to bring up this one anecdote here that there's a guy named Zach Dorfman, a journalist for Yahoo News, Zach Dorfman. And he did this series about the CIA and Ukraine right at the eve of the war. And in one of those, he quotes CIA officers. And these were the guys apparently who were on the ground in Ukraine. And their job was to receive the weapons and distribute them to Ukraine's armed services and whatever, make sure they go where they're supposed to go, whatever. They're the American, middlemen receiving the weapons for Ukraine, essentially. And he quotes them saying, it's almost like they're quoting me, but I'm quoting them. But they're saying, listen, the calibration is off. The measurement, what we're trying to do is pour in enough weapons to deter Russia from attacking. But we're not doing that. In fact, we're pouring in enough weapons to incentivize them to attack sooner than later. And so these CIA officers claimed, believably, that they were telling their bosses to tell the politicians, we should be dialing this down, not up right now. You're making it worse, not better. They could tell from their position. This is what libertarians in economics call the knowledge problem, where these central government officials 7,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., they can't really know. They have their best guesses as to what's going on. And apparently they're not listening to their own agents on the ground who are trying to give them better advice. So you could totally see this from Blinken and Sullivan and Biden's thing. Well, we're just going to keep pouring weapons in there and let those Russians know they better not, because that's how they finish that sentence. And let those Russians know they better not. That's just how they conceive of the whole thing. So it's to them totally counterintuitive if you're saying, no, you're the one making the war happen by doing this. But there's this great professor, I forget his name, I'm sorry, but I quote him in the book, and he's a professor in England who wrote a thing called Now or Never. And he also is not taking Russia's side. He's not justifying it. Just like my title of my book is Provoked, not Good Job, and he's saying the Americans put them in the position of deciding, well, we better do it now or we're going to have to do it later anyway. Only later it'll be harder. So we should go now. And that was essentially the position that the Americans were putting them in, boxing them into a corner, or at least against the wall, where they decide, let's go ahead and fight now instead of waiting till our back is all the way in a corner. And so that was what they did. I really don't believe that Biden was trying to start this war. I think that the Afghan model was plan B. Plan A was you better not. But plan B should have been sit down and talk and come up with a new treaty and be tough enough about it to make it look good and do it. But nope, they wouldn't do that. So instead, plan B was to lock them into this quagmire, this struggle. And by the way, for skeptics there, I got plenty of quotes showing all the way through people who don't remember that period or weren't paying attention or whichever narrow sources, all through the early spring or in the spring of 2022, we have numerous statements from American officials saying that this is the policy, including the Secretary of State and Defense, saying the policy is to prolong the war as long as we can, which again, to all 8 billion other earthlings ought to sound like the most insane thing they ever heard anybody say. It's the most reckless policy maybe in all of American history. I mean, for all of Kennedy and Reagan's brinksmanship, they never played games this crazy with the Soviet Union the way Joe Biden is acting right now.
And I think it's Jeffrey Roberts, by the way, I believe is the.
Oh, okay. That sounds right.
Yeah. At University of Cork. Anyway.
And if you want more proof that the U.S. goal was to prolong the war and have a proxy war, then you have the fact that you had peace talks immediately begin after Russia invades between Russia and Ukraine, but the U.S. and the U.K. opposed the deal that they reached in Istanbul. And on this point, we actually just got yet one more inside source confirming this. We played the clip so many times of Ukrainian officials saying this, of others saying this. Now we have John Daniel Rouche, who was Switzerland's ambassador to Turkey at the time of these negotiations in the spring of 2022, and Turkey is where the talks were held. And he just came out and said that the Americans with their British allies, quote, pulled the plug on the negotiations when they were on the edge of succeeding. And he says the reason is they wanted to first weaken Russia. And he calls this deeply immoral. So this is just yet one more insider coming forward to reveal what we've been talking about for a long time, that there was a peace deal very close to fruition, but the US and UK stood in the way because their goal was not peace and security. It was a proxy war through which they could weaken Russia. But let me ask you, Scott, you have a chapter on how Russia, I mean, although you argue, of course, they were provoked, as you just said, you don't think they were justified. And you go through, your view on what Russia could have done as an alternative to invading Ukraine. And this is a point of contention. Some people who are very critical of the U.S. role in Ukraine, who basically say that Russia had no choice but to invade. That's not your argument. And so I'd be curious to hear what you think could have been an alternative from Russia's perspective to invading Ukraine.
I actually cite you right in that paragraph too, because you were really great on this right at that time in saying so. And I forget which of these ideas was yours. I guess it was bringing in new peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers from a third country to stand there. And then I had a couple ideas, which the first one was just cut off the gas to all of Western Europe immediately, 100%. And tell them, look, man, I mean, like the economic shock that would have caused to Western Europe at the time, that would have been severe hardball. You really going to let Joe Biden put you in this situation and go ahead and look, you're going to kill a few 100,000 people. Then you can find other ways to play hardball short of that. right? So cutting off the gas, look, and that's collective punishment of civilians, and it's not pretty at all. I'm certainly not recommending that, but short of war, it's certainly something that Putin could have done. Another thing is he could have just said, well, screw you. I'm vetoing everything on the UN Security Council until I have my way and get those peacekeepers that Aaron Matei recommended. And by the way, because this was a deal, as you have correctly pointed out in your journalism in the past, this was an issue on the table in 2018 in the UN Security Council. And the Russians were pushing for this, but the Americans, of course, were essentially still demanding that Minsk II be implemented in reverse order first. And only then can you have your peacekeepers, which that was kind of the whole point of the peacekeepers was let's find another way to get the Minsk II deal jump started. The Russians are not going to abandon their border posts and turn the whole border, the eastern border of Ukraine, over to Ukrainian military forces before they allow elections and all of this stuff, which was the new Ukrainian and American interpretation of the deal. So they kept, and by the way, you know, when the Germans would say, well, we never meant to implement Minsk II, we were just giving them time to rearm. I believe other people when they say that, but in fact, Angela Merkel's government was trying to come up with ways, creative ways to get Minsk II implemented because she was, I think, terrified that this war was going to break back out again. And there was a thing called the Steinmeier formula, which was her foreign minister saying, well, look, what if we put the order of operations for implementing Minsk II in this order? And then that way that should be agreeable to everyone. And the new president, Zelensky, who had just won, this is in 2019, he had just won running on peace. He's a Russian speaker from not the far east, but the eastern half of the country. And he had run on peace and crushed his predecessor, Poroshenko, on that. But then the Nazis held rallies all through the fall of 19 into December called the No to Capitulation rallies, where they let Zelensky know that if he would to negotiate with Russia, that was to them sacrificing and betraying all of the martyrs who died in the recent war already. And that if he did that, then they would blow his head off with rifle bullets. And so then he said, oh, yeah, you know what? Actually, I don't agree with the Steinmeier formula at all. And then that was it. And in fact, this calls back to your great interview with Stephen Cohen, where he says, you know what, Aaron, what we could do right now is we could provide this guy some bodyguards and we could help him round up Beletsky and Yarash and the leaders of the Nazi groups there and get him out of that immediate danger so that he could pursue peace. Well, guess who wasn't watching your show that day? Everybody with power and influence, right? And so what happened instead was they did not do that. And this is a constant theme throughout the book where they all know better the whole time and they do it anyway. And that means not just people who I cite as like the greatest and wisest, like Ron Paul and Ted Galen Carpenter and Pat Buchanan and others who saw what was coming and warned, but who were already sort of, you know, I don't want to say fringe political characters, but not representing the mainstream of the foreign policy consensus, that's for sure. But those that did represent the mainstream of the foreign policy consensus, they knew better too. And they all said so all along. When they first started expanding NATO, 2/3 of the Council on Foreign Relations was against it. And when I think this is, I'm almost certain this is right, that once they lost Crimea, 2/3 of the Council on Foreign Relations said, yeah, we kind of provoked this. Right? They did like an anonymous survey of CFR members and said, yeah, we were the ones who kind of made this happen. Unfortunately, they're willing to admit. And even Brzezinski and Kissinger and the leaders of the NATO expanders had said at various times, of course, we'll have to make a special case for Ukraine. The Baltic states, no. America never even recognized Soviet sovereignty over the Baltic states throughout the whole Cold War. America did recognize the so-called republic status of Belarus and Ukraine, but America always, at least rhetorically, only rhetorically, stood by the independence of the Baltic states. So that was going to be one thing. But Ukraine, man, we know how the Russians feel about that because, of course, the millions of ethnic Russians in the far east of the country, which had belonged to Russia for a few hundred years, couple of hundred years at least, and had only been given to the communists by Lenin in 1921 and Crimea by Khrushchev in 54. And so, and Crimea, where their all important Black Sea fleet is based at the Sevastopol base, where it's been since the 1780s, right around the time America's Constitution was being written. And so we know better than to pick that fight. So what we should do is, they had the model from the last Cold War, Austria and Finland. We had established neutrality for both of these countries so that we don't fight over them. And look at a map of Europe. I mean, Austria is right in the thick of things. We could have a fight over Austria or not, and they decided not to. And so we could do the same thing here. And this goes back to, if you want to go back to even earlier proposals where the Americans really were shining the Russians on. They didn't ever really mean this, but what they told them was that we're going to make NATO into a political organization. It'll be sort of like the EU plus America, but it won't really even be a military alliance anymore because there's no enemy. We don't need an alliance. Instead, we're going to have a security partnership with you, our Russian friends, under the CSCE, and then later, and that became the OSCE. But then the second proposal was the Partnership for Peace. And so then Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltics and all of the in-between states can all join at the same time. And then we're all in a partnership together, and everyone's neutrality is guaranteed. It's baked in that we have nothing to fight about because Russia's on the inside too. But then they didn't do that. They were really just telling the Russians that to get them to acquiesce and make it easier for the Americans to go ahead and expand and prevent them from taking measures to prevent it. But the whole time that they were doing that, the wisest of them said, geez, you see what we're doing? We're just moving the line east. We're not erasing dividing lines in Europe. We're just moving it further east. And in fact, in doing so, making the Russians feel threatened by our NATO alliance. And back to the early Biden or the early days of the war and right before the war in the Biden administration, early 22, we know from Derek Chollet, who is a longtime State Department functionary and think tank guy, sort of a Brookings Institute, Democratic Party State Department guy. And he said, going back to the Clinton years at least, and he said, look, we met with the Russians, but we would not put NATO membership for Ukraine on the table to discuss whatsoever at all. All we would say to them when it came to NATO is a defensive alliance. And that's all you need to know about it. And the fact that NATO launched an aggressive war in Serbia and in Libya and went around the UN Security Council to do so and launched a massive war that essentially was an aggressive war against the Taliban that did not attack us on September 11th in Afghanistan. They were under the pretension of defense in Article 5, but it was Al-Qaeda that did that, and they let Al-Qaeda escape. And they took the war to the Taliban and regime change in Kabul and a massive 20-year disaster of a war. But anyway, all you need to know about NATO is that it's a defensive alliance. Russians, you hear me? And that was the only thing they would say. They would certainly never negotiate neutrality for Ukraine, even though, again, the best of them wanted, I don't know if you remember this, Aaron, you might have been too young, and Katie too. But in the lead up to Iraq War II, there was this liberal tag team, Pollock and O'Hanlon, Michael O'Hanlon and Ken Pollock. And they were sort of like the Democratic Party, Wolfowitz and Pearl or something. Crystal and Kagan. They were outside of government. They're the Democrats' answer to Crystal and Kagan, I guess. And they
not Crystal Ball, William Crystal.
That's right. Bill Crystal. And not the comedian either, but the knacker, Irving's boy. Right. And some say my stepson now that I took property ownership of him at the debate in New York. But anyway, I lost my train of thought making fun of Bill Crystal.
In the lead up to the Iraq War II.
Oh, yeah. In the lead up to Iraq War II, Pollock and O'Hanlon and Pollock, they were sort of the liberal guiding lights telling the rest of the liberal establishment, it's okay to support this war. We need to support this war. I think it was O'Hanlon who wrote the book, The Gathering Storm, but they were sort of twin brothers telling liberal Democrats to support Bush's war. That's their role in the world. Anyway, that guy, Pollock, not O'Hanlon, Pollock wrote, and I say this because it's like against interest. I'm saying a guy who is a very centrist foreign policy guy. I'm not saying, see how illegitimate his ideas are. I'm saying he's a guy who fits in with them. And he did a monograph in 17, saying we need to ensconce permanent neutrality for Ukraine. We need to sit down and hash this out with the Russians right now before things get out of control. But as you would inform us in your new book coming out, the implication is obviously built right in there. This is the year of Russiagate. Okay, one of the 3 years of Russiagate, but a big one. And this is it. His book came out right at a time where nobody, and certainly no Democrat, wanted to hear an argument about how we need to negotiate in good faith with Russia about this crucial issue right now.
Yep.
People were living in total la la land at that time, going completely crazy. And if Donald Trump, just like with the UN peacekeeper idea in 2018, he had no political juice or capital to make that happen because of the false accusations against him. He was just way too bogged down. So even when there was a workable plan, he just couldn't do anything about it. I don't know if you guys saw, there's a article by Keith Gesson in the New York Times where he quotes one of Trump's own guys, I believe it is, saying that when it comes to Russia policy, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. His government instead is driving.
Speaking of Trump, another thing that your book debunks is the claim that he was this real kind of oppositional force to NATO. And you actually write in your book, in fact, the Trump administration reaffirmed the Bucharest Declaration. In Tbilisi, Georgia, in August 2017, Vice President Mike Pence said, President Trump and I stand by the 2008 NATO Bucharest Statement, which made it clear that Georgia will one day become a member of NATO. Adding, we strongly support Georgia's aspiration to become a member of NATO and will continue to work closely with this prime minister and the government of Georgia broadly to advance the policies that will facilitate becoming a NATO member, end quote. For those who don't know what the Bucharest Declaration is, can you explain that? And just can you elaborate on the point that you're making here vis-a-vis Trump and NATO expansion?
Sure. If I space out, remind me about the Trump angle at the end, but I'll try to remember. But so to go back to the Bucharest Declaration, this is 2008, and this concerns what should be now the infamous "Niet means Niet" memo. I hope if people have not heard of that before, it's a pretty memorable title there. "Niet means Niet." You can find it at wikileaks.org, and it's by our current CIA director, William Burns, who was at that, and he's a lifelong Foreign Service officer, not a spy. He was the ambassador to Moscow at the time. And he wrote this memo to Condoleezza Rice in late February of 2008. And he's saying, Madam Secretary, don't do it. He's saying, essentially, he's talked to all the experts everywhere in government in Russia, in their national security establishment, all their think tankers and government employees, and including their foreign minister, and everybody is just absolutely unanimous about this. And it's their highest concern, the brightest of red lines. If we bring Ukraine into NATO, it's going to cause a war. Essentially, to quote John Mearsheimer, as he paraphrases the Russians through the years on this issue, them saying, we will break Ukraine before we let you take it away. Independence is one thing. Total Western domination is something else, and we're not going to let that happen. And so it was just the clearest thing in the world. And now Burns wrote in his memoir that he thought that Rice agreed with him. I don't think he says that he knows what she said to Bush about it, but he says at least he thought that she did agree. There's another email that he includes that he quotes in his memoirs where he wrote to her, makes the case. And then he says, Madam Secretary, if you don't agree with me by now, you might as well just quit reading this email now. Because I don't know what to do with you, man. This is the biggest deal in the whole world. He's so intent on getting her to understand. And then we know that Secretary Gates, the Secretary of Defense, also agreed because he slams Bush in his memoir for it. Quite hypocritically, but I don't know. And we don't know whether he confronted Bush about it or what he advised Bush about it. I don't think he makes any claims about that. I mean, he certainly disapproved after the fact anyway. And then also Fiona Hill, who is from the National Security Council from the W. Bush, Obama, and Trump years, and I forget if Biden too, but she's the British American wonk on Bush Jr.'s National Security Council. Now, she says, to the New York Times, she says, if you repeat this now, then you're the victim of a Russian psychological operation. But if you quote her from the New York Times before that, she's saying, look, I'm the smartest person in the whole world. Look how wise I am because I warned George W. Bush not to do it. And she says she has this whole anecdote about how Dick Cheney got all mad and said, you don't support democracy, and stormed out of the room. And Bush said, go ahead, ma'am, go ahead and state your case. And she said, listen, there's a reason that France and Germany are so opposed to this. Again, we're talking about a membership action plan, a proposal to begin to allow Ukraine and Georgia into the NATO alliance. There's a reason that our French and German allies are so against this. It's because it's an unnecessary provocation of the Russians, as simple as that. It's not because it costs too much money. They like wasting money. It's simply because it's putting your thumb in Putin's eye and getting no real advantage out of it. And then she says, and this is totally believable to me, by the way she relates the anecdote, that Bush says, well, I'll worry about Angela Merkel. In other words, forget Putin, forget Russia's concerns. The only question is whether he can get Angela Merkel to do what he wants, and he thinks that he can. And there's another quote from other staff from another source where they said that Bush said, this is between me and Angela. I'll figure it out. When, no, dude, this is between NATO and the Russian Federation, and you're not figuring nothing. So here we have the ambassador and his entire staff, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the entire National Security Council. We know Thomas Graham was also, he was the head Russia wonk on W. Bush's National Security Council. I don't know specifically, but he must have been good on this issue as well, since his entire take was contrary to the Hawks' position on this. All of them telling W. Bush not to do it, but Dick Cheney telling him to do it. And Burns writes in his memoir that why did Bush do it? His own legacy building, quote unquote. So this is what libertarians call public choice theory. And it means that and there's a lot to it, and I should really read some books about it. But on the surface definition, at least, I know what it means is there really is no national interest. There's just the interest of the idiot individuals making the decisions and what they think is good for them. And that's how it goes. So against the entire advice of his entire, and we're talking about W. Bush's government. It's not like this is Ron Paul's cabinet here. You know what I mean? These are W. Bush's guys. And they're saying, man, we should not be doing this. And then he does it anyway. Although Merkel does stop him. She slams her foot down and makes him stop short of a membership action plan. Instead, it's a promise that one day you're going to get a future membership action plan thing, as Aaron was describing before, stringing them along. No security guarantee, but a promise of enough weapons to get you into a fight with your next door neighbor who's paranoid about how many weapons we're giving you. And that process really began right then. And a war broke out in Georgia just a few months later. That was in April 2008. Well, in August.
Thanks to Dick Cheney again.
That's right. And I think the American government was sending Saakashvili mixed signals about whether we might support him or not. I don't think he had a clear green light to go, or I don't know that he did, but he, I think, interpreted at least a flashing yellow light and permission from the Americans to attack these breakaway provinces, South Ossetia, and then I guess he was going to target Abkhazia, but didn't get that far. And that's because you can't join the NATO alliance if you don't have settled borders. And so rather than letting these breakaway states go, he said, I got to retake them by force. And the New York Times eventually and the European Union official investigation did finally agree and rule with all the initial reports, which were that Georgia started the war. Now, you might remember in the campaign of 2008, John McCain lied and Barack Obama echoed his lies, and the rest of the media all went along with it, that this was Russian aggression. That was the key word at the time, that Putin just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and attacked Georgia for no reason, when that was completely false. And we have it from wide and variety of sources that it was either Cheney himself or at least people on his staff who were pushing for attacks on the Russians coming through the Roki Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains to reinforce their so-called peacekeepers in Ossetia. And those peacekeepers in South Ossetia were there under a deal with the European Union, by the way. So they weren't just so-called peacekeepers. They were legitimately there under, Western agreement. And they were killed in the initial assault. A few of them were. So there was the Russians' casus belli to intervene right there. And so, again, it's not to, justify every single thing they did. But in fact, look at the context of that. He could have gone just a few miles further and taken the capital city and reabsorbed Georgia into the Russian Federation by force right then. He could have at least gone far enough to sever the BTC pipeline and stick it in the Americans' eye and occupy that territory. Didn't do that. So, it's not to apologize for him, but just real context.
And then just reminding you, as you asked me to do, the question of Trump and NATO. Right.
So when Pence is reaffirming this idiot policy in 2017 or 18 there that you're quoting, I mean, this is what we're talking about Trump not really being in charge. And a part of this, of course, a huge part of this is Russiagate. But part of it also is just his management style, where he doesn't have any one or two really trusted guys to help him see through his various commands. I mean, there's an anecdote from, I mean, I don't know. It comes from Bob Woodward, but I guess this part is credible enough where from his previous book, where Trump in March of 17 says, I want our troops out of Afghanistan and out of South Korea. And in the anecdote, Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, they look at each other as they walk out of the room and they say, we're not doing that. And then they just don't do that. And then Trump doesn't bring it up again. So was it really in order or not? Right. And he doesn't have someone who's reliable that like has a piece of paper with all these different things written down on it that we got to make sure and follow through on. And so a lot of this stuff just doesn't get done. I mean, you talk about the betrayal of Alexander Vindman, this lieutenant colonel, this Ukrainian American lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council. Well, he'd been placed there by John Brennan. What was a Ukrainian American who hates Donald Trump's guts doing sitting on the National Security Council down the hall? Right? Like you could just go and get some freshman congressman or somebody that you trust to go and sit there. But instead, he doesn't even know who these people are. And he's got, you know, the interagency, the permanent government just overruling his policy. If you check Vindman's testimony in the impeachment and his article in The Atlantic, this is the real whistleblower who got the whole Ukraine Gate impeachment going. It's unbelievable. For the third time in all of American history, he literally was impeached for temporarily holding up an arms deal to Ukraine. And the guy that did it, he said openly that Trump was trying to change our Ukraine policy. Yeah. And he has no right to do that. Who in the hell does this guy think he is? You know, the elected president of the United States sitting in the chair behind the Resolute desk. Who does that guy think he is to tell me, a lieutenant colonel born in Ukraine on the National Security Council, what our Ukraine policy is supposed to be? We in the interagency already had a meeting and decided. He doesn't get to overrule us. I'll have his ass thrown out of office first, declares the lieutenant colonel, 10 ranks lower than the president of the United States or whatever it is. And that's the way it goes.
That was a very telling window into who really runs policy in Washington. It's not the people who are elected. It's the permanent bureaucracy. And on that point, I wanted to show you, I'm not sure if you've seen this, Scott, but you were talking before about how Zelensky, when he tried to implement the Minsk Accords, he faced, you know, violent opposition from neo-Nazis and the far right in Ukraine. And the U.S. didn't have his back. And then one key U.S. official who also, like Alexander Vindman, was a star witness during the impeachment, confirmed this. His name is William Taylor, who was at the time the top diplomat in Ukraine during that time when Trump was getting impeached, or right before it. And Vindman, Taylor later confirmed that he had discouraged Zelensky from implementing the Steinmeier formula, which is named after the aforementioned German foreign minister who was trying to find a way to implement the Minsk Accords. And Taylor later told the Washington Post this. I want to show you this quote. He said, so Taylor tells this anecdote where basically Zelensky's looking at the Steinmeier formula and trying to figure out how he can do it. Taylor says that he told Zelensky, quote, "It's a terrible idea," and that Steinmeier doesn't even know what he's talking about. So basically you had this dual track where you had the far right in Ukraine, plus you had unelected bureaucrats in Washington doing everything they could to undermine the agreed upon formula for ending the civil war that had begun in Ukraine back in 2014. And in that circumstance, you only, Trump, who had no idea, I think, what he was doing on this topic, just not standing up for his own campaign vow, which was to, talk to Russia and even have peace. He didn't want to. He talked about during the campaign in 2016 not having a world war over Ukraine, but certainly the people around him did everything they could to make that possible.
Yep. And I have that quote in the book as well. And it's a parallel because my book does go back to the Bush senior years. So we actually see this over and over again. This is the exact same thing that Ambassador Warren Zimmerman did in Bosnia and had the president, Izetbegovic, tear up the Lisbon Agreement, which could have prevented that war before it ever started, and prevented 2 years worth of 100,000 killed people in a horrible war. And they do this kind of thing all the time. And it's the same thing as you already mentioned that they did after the war broke out. They intervened to prevent peace talks from going through. Imagine Donald Trump was impeached for temporarily holding up an arms deal No one could prove any real quid pro quo extortion effort to have what? Oh, and by the way, and we know now the FBI had possession of a laptop that had emails on it showing exactly what Donald Trump was asking the Ukrainians to look into, was this corrupt hiring of Joe Biden's son to provide political cover for Burisma. And he wasn't demanding it and he wasn't extorting it, but he was saying, gee, there's a bad thing. Now here the FBI, they put out 10,000 leaks against Trump, but they couldn't put out one for him. By the way, we have the laptop and it says that, yeah, he really is onto something here. Nope. And then, in fact, they kept it so buried that 9 months later, they were able to pretend that it had been made up by the Russians and that they'd never heard of it before. It's just incredible. Just incredible. But then Joe Biden can intervene and prevent a peace deal, and he didn't get impeached for that. That's what his job is supposed to be. That's what, Alexander Vindman told him. This is your job, Joe. Go out there and keep the war going.
Well, President Vindman certainly has achieved a lot of his goals. But let me ask you a counter argument to the discussion about Ukraine and NATO. Okay, so someone might say, all right, fine. Yes, all these top officials dating back many years have warned against expanding NATO. But look, the countries in the region, they want this. The Baltic states, countries that were once under the Soviet Union now want protection from Russia. So, who are we to say that they can't have the protection of a military alliance like NATO? Now, in the case of Ukraine, just to answer my question before I throw it over to you, in the case of Ukraine, what people leave out is at the time when Bush and Cheney pushed through that membership action plan promise to Ukraine, public opinion in Ukraine didn't want it. Support for joining NATO was like way less than 50%. And then just to make sure that changed, the U.S. held back the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014, who was promising neutrality and having Ukraine not join NATO. But what about putting aside Ukraine, the other countries in that region where public opinion is actually consistently high in wanting to join NATO? Why shouldn't they be given the chance to join NATO, even if that means pushing NATO closer to Russia's borders?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, the populations of those countries do have a lot of reason to hate and fear Russia, even beyond the enslavement of Soviet communism for half a century. And the Russians have been an imperial state and picking fights in their near abroad and getting away with what they can for centuries. And so, of course, these small, weak countries want to hide behind America's skirts. But the question from the American point of view really should not even take that into account, right? Like their feelings, like we know their history. We understand why they might think that they'd be better off with our protection. But that's a choice that Americans, through our supposedly, popular sovereign government here, that's for us to decide who we want to extend a war guarantee to, right? This is like, a big kid in the neighborhood and somebody else going around making promises of who all side he's on in any fist fight that breaks out or something like that, right? He's got to be able to decide for himself about that. And that also means the same for Eastern European nations as it does for the United States of America, that they have the public choice problem too. That the American people are not truly represented by Bill Clinton or W. Bush or Barack Obama or any of these goons that work for them either. And we don't know what the people of Poland and the rest of those Eastern European nations actually want. We only know what their national government said at whatever given time. I don't know what all the opinion polls are. But again, even giving them the benefit of the doubt that they were representing the will of their populations, that should never be the deciding question for Americans. The question for Americans is this in our national security interest or not? And I think you'll find in the book where you go through that this is the most obvious and most self-fulfilling of prophecies and slowest motions of train wrecks ever, where all of these guys know exactly what they're doing. They all say over and over again on the Russian side and the American side in the 90s, the 2000s, and 2000 teens, look, man, nobody's threatening anybody. Nobody's doing anything. Why, on our side, why do we want to push our lines right up into their face? on the Russian side. We're not doing anything. Why you want to push your alliance right up into our face? This is a conversation that's going on for decades, leading us right into the position right where we are. So, in other words, though the populations and even the governments of those Eastern European countries ought to truly ask themselves whether we're protecting them or whether we're actually threatening them and getting them, just like our government is getting the American people here, into a fight that's truly none of our business. Maybe we're making Russia worse faster and turning Russia into the kind of threat that now they need to be concerned about. I mean, for example, I think we all know that ultimately Russia's going to get away with a major land grab in eastern Ukraine here. Well, what's Putin going to be like after that? Maybe he does want a piece of Estonia. You know, I always forget the name of it. Is it Petch or something? No, that's different. It's this, I'm sorry, I forget the name of it. There's a city in eastern Estonia that's heavily Russian and had long been a part of Russia until the Soviet Union broke up. And right now, they're not being very heavily persecuted, but I don't know. Maybe in Russian public relations, they are enough that they need protection too. And so this whole, projection onto Putin that he is determined to be Peter the Great or Joseph Stalin and recreate all this thing, well, he does have the power to at least be Peter the Great, if not Joe Stalin. He does have the ability probably to seize this city in eastern Estonia. And are Americans really willing to fight for one city in eastern Estonia any more than we're willing to fight for the Donbass? NATO membership aside, we really going to have a nuclear war with Russia over a land grab in eastern Estonia? Another major argument against NATO expansion in the first place is even a Democratic president might say that that's just stupid, dude. We're not trading Washington, D.C. for, Tallinn or anywhere else. And so, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Americans made the Russians the object of our alliance again, still, when they should not have. And they got a reaction out of them. And not only that, but look, the reaction that they got, right, was on both sides. America and Russia have truly broken up, right? Biden has done what he could to try to kick Russia out of Europe, to institute this massive economic sanctions regime, to push them east. You're not a European power. You're an Asian one, maybe, but you can turn east and get the hell away from us. And then all these people killed, all this braggadocious talk about sending home Russian corpses and coffins and body bags, and including killing their generals and sinking their ships and all this stuff. Man, you talk about some hard feelings that are going to be hard as hell to get over. America has really put all of Eastern Europe in a terrible position here, where it just really didn't have to be this way. So, sorry, one more thought and I'll shut up, is because if you look at the history leading up to this guy Putin's been in power for 25 years, guys. His whole policy was to try to suck up to the West, to try to get along with the West. He joked to an interviewer, look, I like eating with chopsticks, but ultimately we're a European nation. We're white Christians, and we're not necessarily the West, but we're part of Europe, not Asian civilization. And so we want to integrate. We want to be part of these institutions and partnership with all of these European nations, and especially the United States, and work together on as many issues as we can and all of these things. And that's not out of their goodness of their heart or whatever, but that's because that's what's smart. Imagine you're the president of Russia. What are you going to do with a problem like the USA? You've got to try to deal, but the Americans just refuse to let them. So in other words, all other things being equal, and we hadn't to pick this fight in Ukraine, he'd have been insane to pick this fight anywhere else, to pick on Poland, to pick on Lithuania, or any of these other countries, especially after they are already NATO members. He'd be crazy to do that, sacrificing America's relationship with the West for essentially nothing. America had to raise the stakes this high to get him to go this far.
I just wanted to know if this has been really fascinating, but if we could shift gears a little bit, because you're so prolific in your writing and analysis, wanted to ask you about some of your thoughts on Syria and Israel. Mm-hmm. And the first question I have about Israel is a question that I ask to a lot of guests, because there's a lot of debate about it. But what is it that makes the West, but the United States in particular, support Israel so unwaveringly? Is it Israel and the Israel lobby dictating U.S. foreign policy, or is it the U.S. using Israel for its own agenda?
Well, it's always a giant conspiracy of interests. I think, the way you frame it, I would say it's more the former than the latter. I think American support for Israel is almost always at the expense of our national interests. Again, under public choice theory, it might be good for some politicians at some times, but certainly against what's good for the most of us. Now, you do have people like Joe Biden, for example, say, oh, yeah, we need Israel so badly. They're our unsinkable aircraft carrier and all this stuff. But he never demonstrates that or even provides an actual argument on how that makes any sense whatsoever. We don't have air bases in Israel. If we did, it would be to the detriment of our foreign policy over there. Our weapons that we pre-position over there, those are just warehouses for the looting, which is exactly what they do, is steal our equipment and use them, to murder Palestinians and Lebanese with. And then what good do they do? What actual agency did they carry out for the United States in the region? The last time they did us a favor was picking a fight with Nasser, when America should have tried to befriend Nasser to keep him. He was trying to lean toward the West before America pushed him toward the Soviet Union back then. The last thing I can think of that they did for us was helping Barack Obama back al-Qaeda in Syria, which he was only doing for them in the first place and was high treason and should have never been allowed at all. But when it comes to our Iraq War I and Iraq War II, not only did they not fight, but if they had, it would have blown up the whole thing. It would have made it so obvious how this was for Israel's interest, which would have undermined everything we were trying to do in those wars. Our alliance with the neighboring states that were helping us do it in the first war, and then, all the different factions that our government was trying to balance in the second war and all the rest of that. But you look at the implementation of the clean break doctrine overall, the Netanyahu doctrine in this country over now the last 29, 30 years here, it's been nothing but a catastrophe for the United States ever since he came to power in 1996. It's just been and ruined Oslo and implemented the clean break to a degree, began to implement the clean break from the peace process and the ultimate tyrannizing of the Palestinians and theft of all of their land. And then how do they get away with it? Money and organization. I mean, because money provides lawyers and secretaries. That's what money means. It means people who get up in the morning, their 9-to-5 job is making sure that boxes are checked and phones are called and emails are sent and things get done. That's what money means. It's not the same as having a volunteer network of anti-war activists when you have a professional office building full of people who work for you to get this stuff done. And they, as Walt and Mearsheimer show in their book, The Israel Lobby, they get the business of democracy done probably more effectively or as effectively as any lobby in America. The AARP or the gun lobby, which the gun lobby, by the way, doesn't represent gun owners' rights. They represent the gun manufacturers and their customers, the government. They are their biggest single captive customers. And so that's what the gun lobby is really about. So nobody gets that mistaken. But anyway, gun rights are, and there are gun owners of America and other, I mean the NRA. There are gun owners of America and others that really do represent people's rights. I don't mean to sell them short. But anyway, they are extremely organized. So there's a million anecdotes of this where any congressman or senator who crosses them gets their ass unelected immediately or very soon. They get sworn vendettas against them to destroy their political career. When a new congressman decides he's running, immediately an AIPAC staffer comes and says, sign here or else we're against you. We're going to support whoever against you in the primary. And if you win the primary, we're going to support whoever against you in the general. And if you win, we'll see you in 2 years, pal. And that's it. And they play hardball and they play it well. And then also they break the law like crazy. And they Grant F. Smith, I think must be the absolute best on this. He's got like 6 books in a row about the Israel lobby and their illegal shenanigans in this country, stealing, and smuggling, fissile material and nuclear triggers and the rest. Arnam Milchan, the guy that produced JFK, he's the guy that helped Netanyahu. They worked together to steal nuclear triggers. Like literally Netanyahu himself was involved in this smuggling ring in the 1980s, the New Mech thing and all that, or after New Mech. Anyway, and stealing all our side's documents when it comes to trade deals and all of this stuff. They're constantly breaking the rules, spying. Jeff Stein, who obviously is Jewish and has and is a former military intelligence officer from the Vietnam War, is an intelligence beat reporter. And he's reported for years that all of his sources in the government say that no one spies on America more than Israel. Not even our enemies, the Russians and the Chinese, spy on America, or our adversaries. They're not our enemies, our supposed adversary states. But certainly no friend of ours. The English can't touch what the Israeli government does, spying on the American people constantly and on government officials and what we're doing. And then, as everybody knows, if it comes down to it, they will trick a guy into having sex with an underage girl and take pictures of it and go, hey, remember that hot chick from the party last night? She was 16 and now you're a slave. And so that goes for a lot of them. That's what Epstein's Island was all about, was Mossad compromising American political and business and academic figures and keeping them under their thumb. And some of them, of course, they know exactly what they're doing. Some of them didn't boy, she sure looked 19 and I'm in trouble now. There's a lot of that. And so look, yes, they play the hardest of hardball. They seem to have only the shortest and highest of time preference, right? If we can compromise and blackmail this senator by having him rape this young American female Floridian child, then that's in our interest. And if the American people absolutely hate us for raping American children later, well, we're just have to compromise them later. I don't know. And they don't seem to look at the long-term future at all. I'm like, maybe Americans will resent it if we're raping their children, or I don't know. Maybe they won't think of us as a friendly state anymore if that starts getting around. And that's just how they operate, and they seem to get away with it. I mean, we have all these promises that we're going to get a real investigation into all of Epstein's co-conspirators once Kash Patel takes over. I'm going to hold my breath starting right now. I sure would like to see it. But I would say that, all of this is, and anyone who looks critically at any of this stuff for a moment could see that supporting Israel is against America's national interests. All this stuff does is compromises on the basic level. In the Middle East, their enemies are the Shiites. But it wasn't Hezbollah that knocked our towers down. It was the bin Ladenites that knocked the towers down. But we're supposed to prefer the bin Ladenites to Hezbollah. Why? Because Israel hates Iran more. But I don't care about that. The last time the Ayatollah blew something up of ours was in 1983, and the Israelis knew that they were going to blow up our Marines at their barracks in Beirut, and they didn't warn us. That's in by way of deception by Viktor Ostrovsky, that they knew all about it. So that's what the Americans get for sticking their nose in our business in Lebanon. These are our best friends, the Israelis. And so, and I'll tell you what, too, the dam is breaking, and it's breaking not just on the left, but it's breaking on the right as well. They have just pushed this horrific war in Gaza too far, and they've gone too far falsely accusing decent people of anti-Semitic motivations, and they just warned that excuse all the way through. And I don't know if you guys saw, but Candace Owens interviewed Phil Turney, the heroic survivor of the attack on the USS Liberty in 1967, and she's got millions and millions and millions of views on that thing. And your people are shocked to find out. And just as I was, just as everybody is when they find out the story of the USS Liberty, that they would dare to treat their greatest patron that way. And that they would be able to suborn our government into suppressing and covering up that story for so long and forcing these men, forbidding them from even talking to their wives or each other about what happened to them for all of those years, driving a lot of them mad, the way that they were treated. The whole thing is just an absolute outrage. That's how much Israel really respects us. So I don't know why any American would respect them any more than that.
And you yourself are, despite wearing a Santa hat right now, although that's not really a Christian thing, but you are Jewish yourself, right, Scott?
Well, I have Jewish ancestry in part, but no, I was not raised Jewish, and I don't really know anything about the religion. If anything, I'm, on my dad's side, we're Anglicans or something. I don't know. Okay. I wasn't really raised religious, but I would identify probably more as a Anglo-Saxon Christian than a Jew. But I do have Jewish ancestry, and I certainly have, empathy and sympathy for all civilians on all sides of these conflicts. My enemy as a libertarian always is the state.
Well, and you certainly give us a lot of reasons to question the state with your new book, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott Horton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. Really appreciate it.
All right. Great to talk to Scott Horton. Again, his book is called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine.
Yeah. And, he was wearing a Santa hat. And I think that's just a reminder of what a gift this interview was. His showing up, his talking to us was like Santa giving us presents. And make sure that you give yourself the gift of Useful Idiots by joining us at usefulidiotspodcast.com, because then you'll hear the full interview with Scott Horton, which includes a very interesting analysis of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. It's pretty spicy, if I do say so myself.
Our gratitude to Santa Scott Horton and to our audience for tuning in to the show. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.